Welcome everyone to this installment of the Legal History Meets Digital Humanities seminar. We're very happy to have Silke Schwand with us, one of the few professors for digital history that there are. It's really only a handful of professorships, I think. When I just counted, I only came to 3. Yeah, and it seems to be something about cities with B. It's Bielefeld, Berlin, and the Bergische Universität. Oh, Bamberg and Bamberg. Okay, and the Wuppertal. Okay, they are not. Wuppertal starts with B, and it's the Bergische Universität. Therefore, they don't have a professorship for digital history, but it's kind of a focus in their history department. Anyway, Silke Schwand, I met Silke in Frankfurt even, so she's by training medievalist and historian, and she finished her PhD in history in Frankfurt with a thesis on the historical semantics of the concept of virtus in medieval times. And as I understood it, thereafter focused even more on the possibilities and also on the kind of epistemological framework connected to digital methods. In doing so, she became full professor in Bielefeld, or professor for digital history since 2020, I think. And as I said, one of the few scholars with this title on the professorship. Also, she's very active in the working group of the Historikerverband for digital history. There are only a handful of people who are running the whole shop, and she's one of them. So we are really very lucky to have her here. She has published a lot on different things. I want to pick out publications on method, because this is what we are interested in mostly, and what we also agreed would be one of the topics of her presentation today. So she's co-editor of one of the central online resources for digital history in the German-speaking countries, the Clio Handbook Online. And she has many publications on scholarly methods like plausibilization, comparing, modeling, and visualization. And I think these are the things that are also of interest for us, and the things that we are looking forward to hearing more about from you today. So thank you for being here. I'm looking forward also a lot to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and thank you for inviting me and for your kind introduction. When I decided, when I started thinking about what to say today, it was rather complicated because there were so many bases to cover. So the presentation today is more of a suggestion for a later discussion than it is sort of ready to use hypotheses or projects. I will talk a little bit about projects that I'm currently doing, also because it's legal history and I'm at an institute where everybody knows about legal history. So this is also nice for me. But mostly I will try to talk about some of the things that Andreas already pointed out. So one of the main questions that I think about at the moment with my students and with our group in Bielefeld is, does digital history actually change the way that we do history? And if it does, how so? So what actually changes? Because we all live in a digital society. So to be honest, calling what we do digital history is actually not very precise, because I mean, everybody who uses a computer, who uses digital tools, digital archives, libraries, we're all engaging in the digital sphere in one way or another when we do history, when we work on legal documents, for example, when we use databases. And because our society basically is digital already, and we have the so-called condition of digitality at present, calling the things that sort of set us apart, maybe from more traditional historical methods, digital history, is actually a little bit misleading. So the next project is to establish something else, maybe call it data history to be more precise about the things that we actually deal with. Because one of the main things that we change is not only the methodology, but our research objects. If you work digitally, you turn a text, a manuscript, whatever it was in the beginning, a printed early modern edition of something, into machine readable formats and into data. And dealing with data is different from dealing with text. And I think this would be a differentiation that would make much more sense. But as I will come to later, the history of digital history or digital humanities is not, we're not as far along yet to sort of give up that little determining adjective of the digital quite yet. But that is sort of one of the things that I am currently discussing with lots of different people, whether or not or how we can be more precise about the things that actually set us apart if they do so. As I started my reflections today, that is sort of the question: what actually changes, how it changes, and what sort of theoretical and epistemological consequences does digital history practice actually have on historical narratives? That is something that I like to think about, and I will touch upon some of these things today. But I wanted to start in the beginning. So the title of my talk was on the screen for quite some time now: how does digitality change history? Digital history methods in an institutional context, because I want to end my presentations today with reflecting on what do we need to make this more broadly available. And there are quite some institutional hurdles that we're still facing when we work on and with digital methods in a historical context. Some of you might know the book that is on the slide. It's not a very long book. It's quite interesting because it tells one possible origin story of what we call digital humanities. And this origin story has to do with Roberto Busa, who was a Jesuit, an Italian Jesuit. And he basically started in the 1940s and 50s a project where he wanted to create a concordance for the works of Thomas Aquinas. I see lots of people nodding, so I'm not going to dwell into that story for too much time. But I think it is important to reflect that digital history is not a new phenomenon. It's not a contemporary phenomenon. It has a long history, as does the term digital. Digital is basically from counting with fingers. So the Latin word digitus, the finger, is basically where the whole thing comes from. So if you want to take it that way, it's an old story. It's about quantification. It's not about digital. It's not about artificial intelligence. It's not about digital platforms. It's basically about quantification and turning something that we usually read in a sequential context from a document into something that can be counted. This is also part of the problem, because historians and other humanities scholars who are used to tell stories are not that comfortable with numbers, because the question, how do I tell a story only with numbers, leaves out so many things that are, not quantifiable, or that are sort of in between the ones and zeros, that are vague, that are ambiguous, and all these kinds of things kind of don't really fit with the numbers part. So working in digital history is also all about trying to bring together stories and data. And Roberto Busa was one of the first people who kind of had the idea to turn something medieval also. So this is really, it's good for me to have lots of medieval examples that I can talk about. It's about the works of Thomas Aquinas, and he wanted to do a concordance to make the words basically countable. And he's holding up one of the punch cards that he used on the old IBM computers. And this is basically what it looked like. These are pictures taken from the institute that was founded surrounding the project. You can still find the Index Thomisticus online if you're interested. So it's still there. It's grown and it's evolved since the 1940s and 50s. But this is basically the work that was done. And you can see Roberto Busa in front of a printer, typewriter. He has a handwritten manuscript in front of him, and then he has like a printed page from the punch cards. And some of you might still remember, so my first seminar thesis, I also printed out with that kind of paper. So again, not so long ago, but still quite some time ago. The endless paper in the printer. The second picture actually shows something that I will talk about later on as well, not in that particular example, but it's all about the invisible work that you need to put in if you want to do digital history. It's about creating data sets. It's about modeling or creating data models. It's about creating databases that you actually use. It's about programming algorithms. It's about developing software. And all these kinds of steps are usually invisible if you think about history. So there's lots of invisible work going into something that we call digital history. And I think, again, this is one example, an early example of that invisible work. If you look at the picture, you can see that this is the work that actually the women did. They entered the data into the computers and they created the punch cards. So it's invisible on more than just one level. I'm not going to go into sort of the whole question of the digital divide and data feminism. That's a whole different topic. I'm not going to go into that today. But what I wanted to point out is in digital humanities and digital history, lots of the things that we do in order to arrive at telling a historical narrative with the new methods is invisible once the narrative is done. And I think that's a problem that I will go back to, or that sort of frames the questions that I want to put out when it comes to the institutional part of digital history. So far, digital history is not new. It's been around for quite some time with different names, but still. It's about quantification. That is something that I wanted to point out. And it's about invisible work. And I'm going to go through some of these points now for the following slides. As Andreas said in the beginning, I am thinking lots about practices and methods. This is partly because at Bielefeld University, we had a big SFB working on practices of comparing. So we did lots of comparing and lots of thinking about practice theory. And I think this is actually quite a nice entry point into thinking about how digital methods change historical methods or what kind of impact they have. If you look up at our everyday practices. So what do? Do we go to the library? Do we open a book? Or do we use a computer to enter like a digital library or a digital version? Do we read texts, or do we use bag of words methods where you just cut all the words into the text into single words and then quantify the words? So I will think a little bit about digital practices in historical research, and I will start with something that for most of you in the audience is going to be trivial, but it's still an expectation that people come to me with when I have colleagues talking to me about, I want to start in digital methods, what do I do? And this is still very real because it is not part of our, like if you go to university now and you do a bachelor in history, even today, it is not normal and it's not sort of part of the standard curriculum to learn about these methods, which is also something that we should change, and that is changing at the moment. But that's why some of the things might sort of seem a little trivial. So when I talk about digital practices in historical research, point one is accessibility and data sharing, sources and material. There's just lots of stuff out there, which is a blessing and a curse at the same time, as most of you might know. Having more information doesn't make your information any more stable or any more reliable. Quite the contrary, having lots of information online actually makes it more uncertain to know anything. And this is something that also happens if you look at, for example, databases with historical sources. So they are kind of more accessible and people start sharing their data. But as I expect you also know, it is not always easy to actually get to someone else's data, which is something that we still are kind of working towards. Then there's the legend or the expectation of the acceleration of the work process, which is, and I'm saying this very deliberately, a legend, because it's not. It will get faster to work digitally once you have done all these steps that I called the invisible work before. And then, of course, you can speed up lots of things. But I'm working on a project that deals with court records from the early English common law, 13th to 15th centuries at the moment. And this is manuscripts and photographs of manuscripts that we start with. So that process of being able to do digital analyses on this kind of material is not fast. And it's not just because we do it digitally, it doesn't have anything to do with being quicker. Network and collaboration, or the building of networks and collaboration, I think is something that actually does work well digitally. We have lots of digital or people in the digital audience today. That's just one example that you can sort of use this to be present in discussions that you would otherwise not have been able to join. Then, of course, digital practices also has to do not only using things that other people produced, but also developing computer-based methods in the humanities or for the humanities. This is something that we've also been trying to do with, for example, our platform NoPake, where the idea was to give researchers the possibility to upload a picture and then get it digitized and then be able to do sort of first analytical steps of corpus analysis and make this as easily accessible as possible. But the question is, what kinds of methods do we actually need in the humanities, and how deeply involved are we in the development of these methods? Because at the moment, we are most of the time reusing methods that were developed in different disciplines for different sources, for building different narratives, and sort of the process of acquiring the knowledge about these methods and tools and finding the right settings to actually implement them to create historical narratives, I think is also important to think about. And then one of the most important things about digital history and practices in digital history is formalization. And I think this is what it basically comes down to. Also, when I started to talk about data history. So we work with something that we turned into data, and we need to think about how to phrase our questions to make them quantifiable or to make them solvable for machines. So formalization is a big thing, and formalization, I think, is also something, and I'll come back to what I said in the beginning about numbers and data, numbers and stories. Numbers are easily dealt with in formalization and are easily formalizable, but stories and narratives and all the interpretation processes, which are so key to our work as historians, sometimes do not easily get formalized. And I think this is one of the bigger challenges, because it also forces us to make decisions that are sometimes painful, because we need something that is basically ones and zeros, and there's nothing in between. And historians kind of like the in-between and the not so clear parts of the story. And this is sometimes complicated. And because it is so complicated, it is really necessary to think about documentation. And this is, I think, something that is actually something that is newer to historians. To actually be forced to document each and every step of our work process and arrive at something that is more than just a footnote. We are very used to do footnotes for our interpretations, and I've read this here and I combined these two arguments, and this is why sort of I came to this conclusion. But that's not the kind of documentation that you need if you work with computers and data. You need to be much more precise. You need to really document every step of the way. And I think this is something, and I argued for something like this also in one of the papers I think that you discussed, the history and theory paper about the black box of interpretation. I think these practices actually bring us to something that is able to help us understand interpretations of other people better than just the discussion in the footnotes. So open the black box of our own thinking and our own interpretations by implementing formalization steps and documentation steps. And I think this is something where actually history or the practices of historians do change, and we have a surplus in the end. And not only for the historical narrative, but also for the ways that we have, the possible ways of interaction that we have discussing regarding our work. So this is basically just highlighting what works and what doesn't. Most of the things are already said. So network and collaboration is green. I think this is safe, and all the rest just opens up new problems that we wouldn't have had if we didn't enter the realm of digital methods or quantitative methods, algorithms, and not to speak about artificial intelligence. I'm not going to talk about artificial intelligence during my presentation. I'm happy to do it in the discussion, but I tend to rather not go too deep into that particular direction, although we try to implement also machine learning methods, but I also don't like artificial intelligence. And I think this is what makes me a historian or a humanist. I really like to discuss the terms that we use to describe things. I started about discussing digital history, and artificial intelligence is another problem, but we will get to that later maybe. So of course, everything that I said is basically making things more complicated. So why should I do this in the first place? And how do I decide whether or not working digitally does actually make sense for me? I'm in the glorious position that I'm being paid for thinking about this. So the fact that I do digital history is part of my job description, but that's not true for everybody. So when I speak about researchers that are really interested in implementing digital methods and digital tools in their particular research projects, my first question for them is, please describe your question, tell me what you want to know, and then we talk about what my suggestions would be in order to formalize this. And I always tell them, and if we arrive at a point where you say, I don't have the time, I don't have the resources, I don't have the understanding, that's fine. You know, it's not everybody needs to do digital history just because it's possible. It's another set of methods in our toolbox. I mean, not everybody does cultural history just because you can, or works in linguistics just because you can, but it always has to suit the research interests that you are envisioning for yourselves. Just a few words, and this comes back to, I basically took away the point that I wanted to make in my starting remarks on data history. I think what is important to think about if you work digitally is you work in quantification. And digital humanities and digital history is by far not the first time that historians deal with quantification. We have a long history of, for example, social and economic history in the 70s and the 80s, where that was a really big thing. They all worked with quantifiable data. It's nothing new. But for some reason, when I started in digital history, and this goes back to my dissertation, which I started 20 years ago, unfortunately, the one thing that people always said is that you have to read your texts. And like, I've never dared to tell anyone that I'm not reading. I'm just using numbers additionally to sort of have another source of information. I don't stop reading. And I think some of the discussions that historians tend to have about quantification have been present ever since social and economic history started to do lots of research on tables and data and social data and all that kind of thing. But for some reason, we kind of forgot that we had this conversation before within our discipline. And of course, I mean, digital history is at least perceived as being something else than just quantification. But I think it's really important to think about the empirical turn in this. Also because it's necessary to criticize this. If you take the empirical turn and quantification some take it in a negative way and calling this new positivism, because we are so empirical. We need sort of the evidence. We need to pinpoint the data points. So this can lead you to something that can be called new positivism, which then might tend to be looked at rather negatively. But I would argue that even though it is necessary to think about the empirical turn and empiricism, it is important to also don't stop there. I think, you know, in order not to do it in a positivist way, you still have to kind of use this as a new source for your interpretation. It's about empiricism, it's about numbers, it's about quantification, and it's about modeling. And this is again brings me back to that what I said, that historical or digital history practices are about formalization. It's about modeling. It's about making decisions. What is part of your model? What do you leave out of your model? And also, I mean, if you can see this in the quote that I put there about the model, I call a model a defined set of interpretative statements describing reality that are considered to be accurate and have a general character. This could also be theory, right? So modeling is nothing, also, again, not new to history. It's just not a lot of people call what we do modeling. You know, we use general assumptions in order to frame our research questions. We use theoretical assumptions about, for example, medieval history or the medieval society in order to sort of have like a framework in which our interpretations make sense. So we do lots of modeling, but a lot of people don't call it modeling. But I think there's something that, you know, where the things that we do in digital history are not so different from what people expect them to be. And Franziska Lötz wrote this in 1998. So it's also, again, 25 years ago. So all of this is something that has been present, but I think that needs to sort of be brought together more deeply in order to understand what the epistemological and also practical challenges in digital history are. So far, I have been very theoretical with a long introductory statement where I tried to explain sort of the general thoughts that I have on why do I do this, how do I do this, and how does it change what I do. So now let's dive into a little example to actually give you an insight on how that I do not only think about this, but that I also try to put this into practice. So I told you about this one project that we are doing with the sources from the early common law. And the data that I'm talking about comes from the so-called court rolls of the justices in Eyre. I don't know whether this phenomenon is known to anyone here. So we are in the High Middle Ages in England. The formation of the common law as a law of precedent and basically case law, I think, which is something that you all know well. In the 12th century, the English king decided to not only have people bring their cases to the King's Court in Westminster, but decided to send the King's Court to the local court sites. This is what the justices in Eyre did. So it's basically the King's judges or the King's bench, which was the name of the King's Court. And you can see that they sort of had a big tour around the country. These tours usually took 2 to 3 years, and they had different sittings at the different court sites. The institutionalization begins in 1166, and there were 6 different routes in the High Middle Ages that these justices took. Why is this interesting? In order to understand legal practices in the early common law. This is so interesting to me because with the justices in Eyre, the people in the local communities had another possibility to take their cases to court. Not take it to the local court, take it to the village, the manor, the shire courts, but take it to the King's Court directly. So for the workings of medieval justice or the medieval justice system or legal system, this kind of opens up a new possibility for people to take their cases to. And one of the general questions that I'm interested in looking at these court cases is not understanding substantial law. I'm not doing legal history in sort of the way that I try to understand which law code came after which law code and how sort of the substantial law developed. But I am looking at, surprise, practices in court. And I'm interested in which people are connected in these cases? Where do they come from? What are the social structures in court? And how does sort of this very, so the logic of the common law and the case law is very procedural, right? So how does that procedure influence the structure of the local communities? And for this question, looking at the justices in Aya is really interesting because it brings just another possibility into the system. In the medieval English legal system, it is possible to take your case to different courts as long as they are regionally responsible for your problem. And I usually look at land disputes. So it's not criminal law, it's civil law, it's land disputes. And the regional court system in England is very overlapping. So you have like a small region, it's the village, and then you have the shire, and then you have the hundred, and then you have the county, and then you have the country. And it's not like, it's not not only a hierarchical structure, but it's a very sort of regionally organized structure. That's what I'm interested in. So the question is now, how do you formalize this kind of question in a way that the documentation of the court records is the right data for my question? So what do I want to know? I want to know what are the people present in court? Where do they come from? How do I model the interaction in court cases? So this is basically just a slide to give you the general overview. This is what the court rolls look like. This is one of the manuscripts from the Huntingdonshire Aya in 1286. This is basically one of the title pages, and this is where the roll starts. So you have to imagine these are not codices or books, it's rolls. So lots of sheets of parchment sewn onto each other and rolling up and down. And I'm looking at the court rolls, which is basically the court documentation, and you can see here is always sort of the marker for this is where the next county starts. And then you have lots of cases that were heard in this county at this very date, and then next county. So that's basically the structure. So you have single cases that are more or less identifiable, also from the structure of the page. This is one source. The other source that I'm using is the yearbooks. The yearbooks are a little bit different. The yearbooks are written by court professionals. And when I say court professionals, I don't mean that there were such a thing as sort of professional judges or professional lawyers in the High Middle Ages or in the 12th and 13th century in England. They are just practitioners. There are people who are present in court, who work or serve as judges, they serve as jurors, they serve as people speaking for other people. Attorneys, attornatus is the Latin term. So it is already there, but there's no law schools yet, except for canon law, because, you know, Oxford was founded in the 11th century, so there's lots of legal tradition from the ecclesiastical courts and the canon law, but sort of the non-ecclesiastical court system has not yet evolved into something that has schools. You will later on have the inns at court, which is basically a pub where people discuss cases, and they discuss cases on the basis of the yearbooks. So the yearbooks are the commentary of people present in court, where they talk about, is this the right case? Did they have the right sort of category for the case? Was that a good decision? And there you can sort of feel the logic of precedent, right? So they are really struggling with the categorization system of the different cases. So I have a court documentation and I have a kind of a commentary. As I told you before, so what I need now is to try to extract information about people, places, cases, and decisions in order to formalize the question that I have about what kind of social structure or what kind of influence on the social structure do court cases have. And I'm using different data types. I have metadata, so I have external information about the documents, the shires, the dates, and all that kind of thing. And I have textual data, so I actually have the linguistic information present in the documents. And now I do a long digitization process. We can talk about this maybe later in the discussion, because that's going to take some time to sort of go into detail now. But there are ways to get from this picture to something that is machine readable. And we are training models that makes this easier. So we have handwritten text recognition in place and all these kinds of methods. I'm not going to dwell onto that too much because I think I'm going to get maybe back to that later. But just one remark. I'm not going to dwell on this now because most of these steps I don't do myself. I reuse things that other people developed and that other people have trained. I have people in my team who do the actual training. I just do observations and interpretations. And this is important. I'm going to get back to that in the end of the presentation because digital humanities and digital history always is a team effort. I cannot do this by myself. Okay, so just to stay on this example a little bit longer. Fortunately, this particular Shire role or the Aya roles have been edited. So just a little remark on editions. At Bielefeld, so Andreas said that there are not so many chairs in digital history in Germany. One of them in Wuppertal is really big on digital editions. Lots of questions about critical editions, how to do this digitally, how to sort of encode the text, how to align that. We had this conversation just before my presentation. I'm not really good in digital editions because other people have been doing this for much longer than I have. What I try to do is I create data sets that I then use to do visualizations and interpretations with. So I am really glad that other people have already done the editing process that I can now use, not only the manuscripts, but also a person register, for example. So I have a list of names already. This is one possibility to arrive at a list of names. There are other natural language processing tools like named entity recognition that can help you also identify names of locations and people automatically. And we are actually trying to also improve this because one of the problems for historians working with named entity recognition is that what named entity recognition does, it gives you a name of a person or a name of a location. It doesn't identify the person. And in my example, imagining there's lots of Williams and Henrys and Roberts and Richards, they all have basically the same name. So the question is, I have a list of lots of Richards, which Richard am I talking about? And is that the same Richard as it was 3 cases before? Is it a totally different Richard? How do I identify Richard? So we are trying to use machine learning tools now. As we developed an annotation scheme, annotating markers that we need to identify in order to find individuals. So what makes a Richard a certain Richard? Most of the time, it's other people that are present in the text because of his familial relations, his wife, his son, his heir. Then location, where does he come from? What is his profession? So there's lots of sort of different markers that we need in addition to the name in order to identify people. So named entity recognition gives you kind of the first step. It gives you a list of names, but then there's lots of Richards. And now we try to sort of train and develop methods that make it easier to actually identify the Richard as a certain Richard, or at least, you know, instead of having 25 suggestions, have like 5 suggestions that you can then use. And this has all been done in the edition. So basically what we try to do is find new methods to speed up the process of writing a register. Maybe this is interesting to some of us, in identifying people in large corpora. But I was very happy that for my example now, I can use the register that was done by someone else. So this is just an example. It's about Agnes Engli, the widow of John. And there you can see how the register is basically organized. So you have some information also about their social strata. So you can see here, after the name, there's a V in brackets. So the editors of the edition have decided to give or to design a social structure and design categories where they put people into. And V is for villager. So I have information on the people and their social strata. And I'm going to give you this here again. So V is for villager. Then we have regional landholders. So the people who actually own the land. Then we have knights, which is basically nobility, more or less. And we have clerics. These are the four categories that it identified as the social stratas or categories present in the documents. And what I did now, and this is just, as I said, I'm being very general today, so the example is very small. But this is now an example of the things that I tried to do. So I was interested in the kinds of people that meet in court cases, right? In order to kind of analyze, find the interesting ones, go back into the document and then interpret what is happening there. So what I did is I calculated lots of tiny little networks, which you can see in the visualization. This is done with RStudio, so it's basically a statistical programming language tool. And what I got out is lots of little network visualizations. I'm using the cursor, so I hope that the Zoom audience can also see what I'm pointing at. Usually you have one of the gray circles in the middle. This is representing a case. And then you have people connected to the case. And the color code of the people is according to the social strata. So I have villagers. So the ones where I have like a gray node and then I have the red ones they are within one social strata. So it's villagers against villagers. The interesting ones are the ones where the color changes, right? So you have, for example, this one here is really interesting because it has one case and it has representatives of all the four stratas that were identified in one network. So there's one case that actually connects lots of different people from different social stratas. So this is something where I would now go back and read the cases, right? So this is not any kind of result of my research. This is just another way to observe something in the data and to get suggestions and pathways into the corpora. Because I have thousands of court cases. That's a huge corpus. And this is one method in trying to, using these kinds of quantitative methods and network visualizations to arrive at my next question. Because now I would go back and I have a question for this case. Why are there so many different people? What this also helps you with is checking your corpus and checking the data sets and whether it works or not. Because maybe some of you have already seen there's mistakes or there's little networks that don't make sense in the way that I was just describing them. For example, the one in the bottom right corner where it's only red dots, there's no case. So, and this can have different reasons. Either my data set is not clean, so there was no reference to a case, just to people. And then the question is, why is that? If you go back to the data set and you look at this particular case, it actually helps me learn something about the structure of the document because the case is not written down again because it had been tried already. So these are people that were basically in an open court case, but they had to reappear for the next session 2 weeks later. So the case is not kind of described and opened up in the same way. They just say, so the reappearance of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's the story. So you have a network that doesn't have a case. So in this way, these kinds of visualizations and these kinds of pattern recognition tools that I'm trying to use actually help me understand something about the cases that I wouldn't have had the chance to see as quickly if I just started reading. So it's structural information, it's information about the people, it's information about the structure of the documents. This is just a very small example. We can have lots of discussions about this example and other questions later on. But what I wanted to demonstrate with this are what my understanding of quantitative recognition can actually help me guide my interpretation and find something that I didn't see before. Especially, for example, if I look at linguistic observations, but also looking at these network visualizations, trying to find the right questions for the data that I'm looking at. Second, interaction of pattern recognition and modeling through computation. So it's about operationalization. And I tried to sort of give you an understanding of how I came to that particular network visualization by starting with a very historical question. I want to know something about the people and what they do in court and how they interact across social strata. This is a very typical historical question. There's no digital interest whatsoever, right? It doesn't have so much of, it's not, in its core, it's not a quantification question. But I can use quantification and the operationalization that I get from the modeling of my question, from the modeling of my data set, from these methods of pattern recognition to actually get a new idea or like a pathway into my material. For this, research questions need to be formalized. I've been talking about this quite some time now. Formalization needs documentation. You can never say this often enough. But this, up until there, is in the way that we talk, that we build historical narratives, all invisible work. Because most, like if I was write an article about this, the social or the court cases as arenas of social interaction, whatever the name is, do I, in an article for the HZ, do I actually describe my data mining process? What is the place for all these kinds of reflections? Because digital analyses are just part of the research process. This is not the result that I want to present. This is just another way to find a good entry point. And it's always a combination of quantitative modeling and qualitative interpretation. So it's never either or. It's more of a spectrum. You know, you start with numbers and then you go back to reading and interpreting, and then you have an interpretation. Maybe you change the data modeling, create new visualizations. It's a very iterative process. You do this over and over and over again. And in the end, we all want to arrive at a plausible narrative. And this is basically what historians do. They build plausible narratives about the past. And I'm convinced that there are lots of different ways to arrive at a plausible narrative and different methods to support the plausibilization process. And quantification and working with data is just one of them. There's lots of other things that you can use in order to arrive at the plausible narrative. And because I've been talking for quite some time, I'm just going to go quickly through the institutional challenges, because maybe this is also something that is, so it is not only challenging for our interpretation processes to work the way that I suggested. It is also challenging because of the infrastructure that we have and that we are used to using. And as I said before, digital humanities is a team effort. You cannot do these projects by yourself, except if you have lots of money and lots of time. You're like a senior researcher, you've done everything that you wanted to do, and this is like your pet project. Maybe then you can do this by yourself. But even then, you will use methods, algorithms, databases that have been created by other people. Our institutions don't work this way, especially in history, they don't. This is one of the reasons why when I became a professor, I had to make a decision if I wanted to be a professor for digital humanities or digital history. And I made very clear that I want to be a professor in digital history because I still do history. I don't want to do humanities because it's just too big. I cannot be a digital humanist because I don't do literary studies. I don't do linguistics all the time. I have this art history. There's so many other paradigms in these different disciplines that are part of the humanities that I said, I'm a historian and I want to work in history projects with these kinds of methods. So I decided that I need an institutional framework where this is very clear. I can speak for history. I don't speak for the humanities. Digital humanities is a big field. This is taken from an article written by Patrick Sahle, a guy in Wuppertal who's really big in digital editions. and was one of the first historians having a professorship for digital humanities. And he tried to kind of map out the field with this visualization. So you have computation, you have digital humanities in the center, and then you have the disciplines where the people come from, sort of the disciplines of origin or the core disciplines of the humanities in the outer circle. Also computer science, because it's not only a team effort, it's also an interdisciplinary effort most of the time. And then in the circle in between, you have these disciplines or the fields where kind of the both meet. And for me, as you can see, history and digital history is basically, that's my playing field. I don't want to go too deeply into the other humanities disciplines, although some of the problems and some of the epistemological challenges that I've been talking about are also present in the other humanities, of course. But I always try to make sure that I come from a history standpoint. Digital humanities, actually, digitization in the humanities started with history. Most of the time, it started with digitizing historical materials out of conservatory reasons in libraries and archives. So there was, at the beginning, there was lots of history people. Now it's lots of language people, which is not a problem because we also work with text, so we have to understand language, but it's sort of a different direction. And I think it is important that, so for the history of digital humanities, it was important in the beginning to start with a separation of people who share the same practices, who share the same understandings of why we should do quantification, in order to sort of develop standards, develop methods, and sort of talk to each other. I think now it's become more and more clear that we have to leave that area of, just sort of be this in-group of people who know digital humanities and move back to the other disciplines and just become one of all the other historians who just has a specialization in working with digital methods. I wanted to give you, but I'm going to skip this now. I wanted to actually do this history of institutionalization now. Also looking at the development of technologies, because most of the things that we do when we talk about digital history are not driven by historical interests. They are driven by developments in technology. Lots of the things are being done because it's possible to do them. It's not always sensible or, it's just possible. Same with machine learning and what we call artificial intelligence. It's possible, so we do it, which is fine. But I think it's important to sort of reflect on, do historians now also have to do this just because it's possible? Or is there like a deeper understanding and reason, an argument to actually apply these kinds of methods? And I hope with my little example of the medieval history cases, you could see that there are parts of these projects where it makes lots of sense to apply these kinds of methods, but there are also parts of a project where it just doesn't make any sense. So it's not only about using the possibilities. At the same time, I think, and this is where I started my presentation with, we live in a society that is digitized. It is digital. I don't like the term digitization because it always sounds like, it's a process that can be stopped. We are digital most of the time. I mean, if you talk about infrastructure, there's quite a lot of work to do yet still. But the way that our society works, I think we are at a point where the digital is very present. So in this sense, I think it is important for the humanities and for history especially to also interact with digital media, with data sets. We have to be critical about the application of data. We have to be critical about the application of artificial intelligence because we can. One of the main competencies and one of the main practices that we learn as historians is being critical, do source criticism, try to arrive at plausible stories, be scientific about that. And I think for the time that we are in now, in the context of fake news and all these kinds of different discussions that are linked to the digital, it is really important for us to be present as a critical voice in these developments. So 1949, this is the IBM project with Roberto Busa. This is where I started, right? So there were possibilities and they were used. And you have here, so the diagram works in that way. You have like a a timeline, and then you have the technology that was available, then you have the things that were done in the humanities with that particular technology, and then you have funding schemes. Because it is also important, if we talk about the history of digital history or the digital humanities, to talk about funding schemes, because some of you might have noticed there's money in digitization. So if you design a project and you have like a digital part, people tend to like that. Sometimes they really don't know why, but most of the time it actually helps a project to get funding. So there's a big driving factor in the early times of the digital humanities were these funding schemes with the Natural Endowment for the Humanities in the United States, but also with the DFG funded digitization projects in the beginning of the 1990s. Yeah, so we are now in the big tent phase. Digital humanities can be anything that has anything to do with the humanities and something that can be summarized as being digital. But there were steps on the way. So we had the PC revolution, quantification got less important, and then we developed more standards for encoding. The internet revolution is just a revolution also like of more information, the availability of sources and digital things. And there you see, and this is where also the TI, the text encoding initiative, started to be involved in, okay, if we do the digitization, let's do it in a good way. Let's think about standardization and representation. And now we have, especially for Germany, the BMBF has put quite some money into the digital infrastructure as well. To sum up, not only the methodologies, but also the problems that we have working this way within our own institutions. So it's really good that we have professorships in Germany that are called digital history, but it's free. That's not enough, obviously. I'm in a very good position to have one of those. But the institutionalization process of the digital humanities was driven mostly by libraries and archives in the beginning. So we have lots of centers for digital humanities that understand themselves as service centers. They do digitization, they do Beratung, recommendations in the way which methods to apply. Trier is very big, Cologne is very big. Münster is also now has been growing over the past 5 years. The professorships and what I do in Bielefeld is more on the research side. I didn't want to have a service center. I wanted to be a historian doing research on historical topics using digital methods and it's just it's a shift in perspective. I think we need both of them because you need lots of resources for digitization that a professorship cannot provide. So you need institutions like the universities, libraries, or archives and so on. But you need collaboration there as well. So the institutional effort is actually a shared effort. But I think it's not only professorships, it's questions of recognition and teaching. So with digital humanities or digital history, I also said this in the beginning, in Bielefeld, we now decided against a master's program in digital history because that would be, again, a specialization. It's always good to have specializations, but with digital methods, the critical reflection of data and its influence on the society should not be a specialization. It should be something that people learn in a bachelor's degree in history, just on the fly. It should be part of the first 2 years of a study program. So what we did is we designed little open educational resources, digital courses that people can use in their introductory courses at the university. So it's not only me who teaches digital history, but with these open educational resources, I can also have other colleagues of mine interact with digital methods on a very low level without them telling me, and rightly so, what else do I have to do? It's always an on top criterion. So teaching is important, and also recognition. I was talking about the invisible work a lot today, because I think we need new forms of publications for the kinds of work that we do if we work in digital history projects. We need data papers where we discuss data sets. We need, like, for example, the Hazard Kult platform. Maybe you know that. It's also from the Clio Online. It's provided, there's lots of reviews of books. They do have, but they don't do this very often, also reviews of websites and data sets. And this is something that we should be more comfortable with, because if we start to use this more often, we also need sort of a tradition of criticizing in a, not in a negative way, but sort of critically acclaiming these kinds of works as well. You need big teams to do this. We need to talk about publication formats for our historical research, like podcasts, for example, or other media or publication formats that the society uses already, but science doesn't so much. And I think podcasts is a really good example, because you've got lots of historical podcasts now. You've got lots of sort of scientific podcasts as well. And this is something where you can see that sort of our output channels are changing, and we kind of go into the digital spheres that the society kind of expects or uses now for communication. Publication formats also have to change according to representing the team effort. So we need to move away from single authored articles to more than one authored articles, right? And the digital humanities community does this, but I think in history it's still, some of the people do it, and then it's difficult, and who did what, so it's kind of the recognition of your work, and this is also changing now. So to sum up, digital history needs new institutional structures. I think lots of them are already in place. It's just bringing them together. It's sharing information, it's sharing data, it's sharing expertise, that we should actually be much more open and much more deliberate about. So what does change if you do digital history? First answer, short answer is not much, because it's still history. And it's important that it doesn't change the whole thing, right? There are certain questions, certain research fields where linguistic observations, quantification makes more sense than in other fields. Like cultural history makes more sense for some research questions and not for others. What changes, and I think which is very obvious, is the scalability of our questions. So we can use many more data sets than we did before. But we have to be careful that not to stay on the surface. So distant reading should not be the point where we stop. We should always go back to the sources and see whether our generalizations actually sort of matches and represents the things that we see when we zoom into our material. And there are some transformatory things present in these methods, I think. If you now go into machine learning and all that kind of thing, that just changes the way that we interact with machines. But this is not specific to history. That is specific to humanities, or this is something that we as society and as the sciences in general need to think about, how these interactions between man and machine change in our present day. And this should also be reflected in the work that we do as historians. I'm going to stop here. So thank you very much for bearing with me for an hour. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you.